Hi there, Ron Gula from Gula Tech Adventures, and today I'm very excited because we're going to talk about vulnerabilities. Now, before I started Gula Tech Adventures, I was the CEO for Tenable Network Security. Before that, I had done penetration testing for the National Security Agency, so I basically lived vulnerabilities for about 20 years. And I get a lot of questions from the general public. What is a vulnerability? Now, the software definition is a software weakness. Somebody wrote some code. The code gets input from something, maybe an email, maybe a user typing something, and then boom, you have malware, you have code, you have stuff that's being written. But for the general public, this is really hard to get your head around. Like right now, I'm talking to you on a fully patched Windows computer, and there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, or maybe millions of vulnerabilities that have yet to be discovered in that, just because software is so complex. So what I like to talk about vulnerabilities is in terms of risk. Now, if you think of a threat and a vulnerability, you need to have a threat and a vulnerability before you have risk. In other words, if you have no threat, then you can have all the vulnerabilities in the world, but if nobody's going to really exploit that vulnerability, then you have no risk. And very similarly, if you have all the threat in the world, but you don't have a vulnerability, then you really don't have any risk. And a lot of times, this is a kind of an odd, thing, because people will say, hey, is that computer patched? I've got software on, but I'm not using it. Well, am I vulnerable to that? Could somebody really exploit that? It's kind of a hard thing. And a lot of times when I was doing penetration testing for the NSA, we'd say, well, this is a top secret network. Everybody on here is a trusted top secret security cleared individual. Well, maybe one of those persons is reality winner. And, you can't just assume that you don't have a risk from people on the inside like that. So when you talk about exploiting a vulnerability, though, there's really three different ways you can exploit a vulnerability. And this is called the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triangle. Basically, no matter what you've seen in any hacking movie or hacking TV, or you heard about something like SolarWinds or the Colonial Pipeline hack, one of these three different properties got violated by the person exploiting the vulnerability. So let's talk about confidentiality. Confidentiality, if you and I have a secret, maybe it's my password, maybe it's a sensitive email, maybe it's the top secret plans for the new Virginia nuclear submarine, we need to keep that confidential. Now, any vulnerability in your email or our communication systems or where we store these things can lead to the loss of confidentiality. The Russians or the Chinese can take that data, or your competitors. Now, integrity is a little bit different, right? If somebody can read that data and break confidentiality, maybe they can actually change what's in there. And in the case of a bank account, maybe a bank would want me to change the integrity of my bank account if I add a zero to it or not. Or maybe your grades in college, or maybe your blood type when you're getting a blood transfusion. So impacting the integrity of that data, a vulnerability can be used to exploit that. And finally, you have availability. Now, availability is the resource that you're looking at. Is it still available? If you think about all the different ways we go to the cloud today, use the internet, stream movies, do texting, if part of that goes away, then that's a serious attack. And we're talking about Russian attacks on the power grid in Ukraine and possibly in the US right now. But at the same time, imagine people took out our supply chain, and not just our supply chain of how we get food and water, but think about how software is built today. Software is built on 90-95% of other people's libraries and services. Taking out one of those small things with the denial of service attack could lead to many of those things. All of those things are vulnerabilities. And when you think about it, they all have to do with attack vector. So every one of those scenarios I just went over, especially talking about the threat, the vulnerability, and the risk, you have to think about your attack vector. You can't get a phishing email if you're not looking at email. But if you're browsing the web and you're actively using your web browser could be attacked if you went to a hostile website. You might not even know it's a hostile website because it might say CNN or Fox, and some advertising that's being rendered on their website might be delivering you a zero-day malware attack. So there's all sorts of ways to think about this. When I used to do penetration testing, we typically did it outside in, or we simulated and Edward Snowden a reality winner where we had a position of trust and we tried to hack into an organization and learn data that we couldn't do. So these attack vectors really have to make you stop and think about how people can break into your organization. Now, to think about this really simply, typically when we learned about IT 15, 20 years ago, we only had clients and servers. The client was like our workstation and the server was where we had all of our data. Typically, the clients had applications like a shell or a web browser or some sort of X Windows client. And the servers where the applications were at, our databases, our web servers, our email servers. And it was pretty easy to think about how do you attack these things. If I want to attack the client, I have to wait for those services to come to me. So in other words, if I want to attack a vulnerable Chrome web browser, I need to wait for that vulnerable Chrome web browser to come to my web server where I can then attack it. And vice versa, if I want to go scanning for targets, I'm probably going to go scanning for servers. But what happened over the last 15 years, and it was the concept of what's a client and what's a server from a network point of view, has gotten totally turned on its head. There's clients that have open ports on them for file sharing. For example, the Dropbox client allows you to connect locally. There's a lot of video games where if you have two of those video games talking to each other, they will actually share data locally. Certain applications such as Zoom actually have ports that can be exposed to local networks. This is why firewalls and things like that are so important, but also the concept of what is a client and what is a server has really gone away because servers have moved to the cloud. So now when you start thinking about where your data is at, you can always say the cloud is somebody else's computer, but if your data is being hosted at a cloud provider and behind that cloud is actually firewalls and servers and different types of ways to store the computing power in that data, then you've got an ability to kind of exploit them and perhaps lose data from up there. So what's a vulnerability? What's a client? What's a server? It's become very, very fluid today. Now, one of the things that make this really hard to understand what your level of risk is from these vulnerabilities is how do you compute all this stuff together? So a couple years ago, I wrote this blog on how do you actually take that simple equation of risk equals your threat times your vulnerability and try to apply it so you could compare complex networks. It's really, really hard to do. I encourage you to read this. There's some great vendors out there trying to help us manage our supply chain and try to give tools to do that. I like to quote Tony Sager here that some models are more useful than others, and it's a good way to kind of think about measuring risk. At the end of the day, if you're hearing about vulnerabilities from the first time watching this video, I recommend patch your computers, don't run software that you don't trust, and think about things before you click on them. If you want to learn more about these kind of topics, I encourage you to visit gula.tech. We've got our whole set of portfolio companies there. Some of them have to do with patching and risk management, simulating attack paths and whatnot. We've also got a lot of probably 5 or 6 years of blogs and videos that are there for your browsing. Thanks for watching, and keep finding and filling those vulnerabilities. Thank you very much.